My family knows, like, don't throw anything out. Like, you better not throw anything out. Seeing food go to waste for me, like, it just does something to my soul. I hate to see food going to waste.
This is The Zest. Citrus, seafood, Spanish flavor, and Southern charm. The Zest celebrates cuisine and community in the Sunshine State. I'm Dalia Colon, and my voice is pretty much back to normal thanks to some vocal rest and a lot of hot toddies. Today, learn how to cook, pray, and slay with ingredients you grow yourself. This week, we're heading into the backyard of Ginain Grays. The busy wife and mother shares family-friendly recipes on her website, CookPraySlay, and she hosts the podcast Cook the Garden, where I was a guest last week on episode 1 of season 4. I visited Ginain at her home in Riverview, just up the road from me, for a tour of her garden and a chat at the kitchen table. In our conversation, Ginain explains how her native country of Suriname influences what she cooks. She offers creative uses for food scraps, and she shares why she views gardening as a spiritual experience.
Cook, Pray, Slay is a combination of so many different things. Obviously, the cooking piece of it. And when people meet me, they automatically think like, oh, you've always been into cooking. And really, that's not the case at all. I grew up, like, I'm the youngest from out of my siblings. And so growing up, my mom always cooked, my older siblings, and it's not really until well into my adulthood. And when I started having kids, I'm like, okay, I should probably start, learning how to put a few meals together. And so that's how I started cooking and just being creative in the kitchen. So that's obviously the main element of it. But I always think about the faith side of it too, because faith is a really big thing for us. That's what drives me. That's what drives my family. And my faith is a really big part of everything I do. And of course, you're cooking, you're praying, but you got to slay at the end of the day. And the term slaying is really just, it can mean so many different things, but it's really I think of it from a busy career, woman. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a professional. And how do you manage all of that and still nurture your family? And so we do the best we can. Some days, hey, you're winning, and some days maybe not so much. But at the end of the day, we're gonna slay.
I love that. So when you started cooking for your family, what were some of those meals that you embarked on early?
Sure. So I immediately pulled from how I witnessed my mom cooking and the foods that we ate. I'm from Suriname, South America. Although you can't tell, I don't have an accent. I'm the only one in my family without an accent. I grew up in the States here. So I was 3 years old when my family came over. And so, I think about how my mom used to cook. We have a very vegetable-rich diet. Growing up, we had rice, your meat, and a veggie. That was pretty much it. So I just naturally started cooking like my mom. But some of my favorite meals were like easy, one pot, simple meals that I could put together very quickly for my family because I was always on the run.
I completely understand that. We were just talking about how busy it is with kids and sports and all that. So tell me about your family.
Oh, so my family, so there's my husband, of course, and my 3 girls. I have 3 girls. They're about to be 20, 17, and 12. And they keep us so busy. They're amazing. I try to get them in the garden and in the kitchen. It's a lot of fun. They keep us on our toes, that's for sure.
Oh, completely understand that. Yeah, we got to talk about the garden in a little bit. But do you have any go-to meals? It seems like every parent is looking for that meal that's a home run, that doesn't take a lot of time, and that the whole family will eat.
So I think of food like seasonally. So right now, like I love my chicken chili. And it's so hearty, it's so easy to put together, and I incorporate seasonal vegetables in there. So I love it because you can really switch out based off of what's seasonal and available in your area. So my chicken squash chili right now is on repeat.
Ooh, we might need to get that recipe from you. Chicken squash chili. I love that. Okay, and then where did the garden come into play? Did you grow up with a garden?
So I didn't grow up with a garden, but it's funny. When I think about my love for the garden, I do feel like part of it is ancestral. I remember going back several years ago when I was about 10 or 11 years old, probably my youngest daughter's age, going back home to Suriname. And one of the things that stuck with me was going to my grandparents' home. They had a farm. And going there and seeing like how self-sufficient they were, how they were growing their own vegetables and they were raising their own animals, that kind of stuck with me. I didn't realize how much it stuck with me, but it did. It's not until I got into my adulthood and in our previous house, my husband and I started kind of dabbling into tomato plants. We planted a plum tree. And so it was always a goal of mine to just have a larger garden and to grow and eat the food that we grow. And so it started when about maybe 6 years ago when we moved into this home. And we put in some garden beds back there and we just started growing stuff. And it just became my refuge and my creative outlet.
So what do you have growing in the garden?
So right now I don't have much, unfortunately. It's been such a busy year, but I always have greens. Like I always have mustard greens, collard greens. I'm always growing some kind of pepper. I've got different peppers, habanero. I've got the hot stuff and I've got the mild stuff as well. Bell peppers, that kind of stuff. Oh, and of course my herbs. I love herbs.
Yeah. And herbs will take you a long way. Even if you're making a microwave meal, you throw some herbs on there and maybe a squeeze of citrus and it actually tastes fresh.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference. It really does. And herbs are so easy to grow. Like I always say like herbs are kind of like a gateway plant into, getting started into gardening. They're really easy to grow. And like you said, they elevate your meals so much. They're great. So flavorful.
Yeah. And even if you don't have a nice big backyard like you do here in Riverview, somebody could grow a pot of herbs on their balcony in an apartment building. So love herbs. What are some plants that remind you of home? You talked about how gardening feels ancestral to you. I don't know if there are particular plants that you remember from Suriname. I know you were a little girl, but what would some of those plants be?
Honestly, I don't remember because I was so little, but there are some plants that do remind me of home, especially maybe it's the greens. I feel tied to them for some reason when I grow mustards. Well, now I kind of have mustards growing like sporadically throughout my yard. And I believe that's because I kind of let them just go to seed. I don't pull them up. I let them go to seed. And so now if you walk through my yard, like you'll just see little sprouts of greens propping up. And I'm totally fine with that. It doesn't bother me at all. So I do think the greens kind of remind me of home. There's a particular type of plant that is native to Suriname, Brazil, that area. And I don't know the name of it in English, but my dad, he actually gave me a cutting. And so I have that right now growing in the garden. It's kind of growing wild in the garden. So
what do you call it?
It's called Tijerblad in Dutch. It's a green, it's very medicinal as well. It's a beautiful, deep green, almost kind of like a spinach. It looks very similar to like a spinach leaf. And you can saute it. You can put it in teas. Like I said, there's so many medicinal properties to it. So yeah.
So you were cooking, praying, slaying. You've been gardening for years. And then where did the podcast come into play?
The podcast came into play just kind of very general, sharing recipes. And I started sharing some things from my garden, and I noticed people were asking questions, like they wanted to know more about what I was growing or what are you doing with that big old eggplant that you just harvested? And I realized that, especially, I think COVID changed the way people think about our food system as well. And that's when I really realized, like, wow, people are really interested in it. They want to learn more about it. And why not help empower people? For me, it would just almost came naturally for me. But I know to some people, it can be a little bit intimidating. So that's when I really started leaning into it. And that's when the podcast was born, basically. It was just out of me wanting to lean more into the gardening, sustainability, and how to take what you're growing and turning it into something delicious and nutritious that you can feed your family.
You mentioned eggplant. What are you doing with that eggplant? Because for the first time, I am successfully growing an eggplant. And I'm so excited for my little baby eggplant. But part of me is thinking, what am I going to do with this?
Oh, I love that question. So I love eggplant. I grow eggplant like every year. It's always in my garden. But one thing that I do with it, I grew up watching my mom prepare it like this, but it's almost kind of like an eggplant stew. I know you're a vegetarian, so you can really amp it up with mushrooms, peppers, veggies, any kind of vegetable that you have, and make a stew out of it. So what I do is I dice up the eggplant, saute it in your onions, tomatoes. If you've got some veggie stock or broth, you can add some of that in there and just let it simmer and add in your mushrooms. You can add in jackfruit just to kind of like give it that heartiness. And you just put that over your rice, or you can have it with a side of potatoes or whatever you want with it. It's so good. But I normally put like a fish, like a salted cod with it, and so good.
It would smell amazing. I usually roast eggplant, but everything you just described, I think the eggplant would absorb those flavors and it would smell great while it was simmering. Because a lot of times eggplant is just bland if you don't know what to do with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. So it will actually like soak up all of those flavors. And that's why I love eggplant. To me, it's very versatile. I've also done like air fryer eggplant. You know, you can do eggplant parmesan. Like you can really get creative with it. So that's actually one of my favorite veggies.
I love how veggie forward your recipes are. And I actually at first thought maybe she is a vegetarian, but then I poked around a little bit. I'm like, okay, there's some meat on here. Yes. But just cooking from what's in your garden, you're naturally going to eat more veggies. So can you talk to the person who wants to lean into eating more plants?
Absolutely. So for me, I kind of refer to myself as a flexitarian. I mean, I can literally eat vegetarian with no problem. But every once in a while I do crave like a steak or whatever. But for me, it's all about balance. And you're right. When you start growing your own vegetables, it's just naturally that you start eating more of it, right? I've got fruit trees as well. I'll show you later. But, just fruits and veggies and you just automatically want to start incorporating that into it. It's such a rewarding feeling. So those of you listening who are really wanting to, lean into that, you want to find ways to incorporate it. You want to, start snacking on it, instead of those chips that you've got in there, you can take your veggies, your greens, you can make kale chips, you can make spinach chips, you can take your eggplants and make eggplant fries, just getting creative with what you have. And you'll just find yourself not even thinking about it, but it'll just naturally start happening that you'll start leaning into that and changing your diet.
My daughter loves kale chips. We make them in the toaster oven with just like, you have to massage the kale with olive oil, a little bit of salt, and then like slow and low, maybe 275 or so for like 25 minutes. And they are crispy and they have a chip-like consistency. Aren't they great? Yeah, they are. So I wanted to ask you, what do you know now about gardening that you wish you had known when you started?
Ooh, that's a good question. The way I think about gardening has shifted so much. As a gardener, especially when you're first starting out, I think you put a lot of emphasis on what's dying. Like, oh my gosh, like, did I just literally kill that plant or whatever? But you start changing when you realize like how nature really works. The garden takes care of itself. So a lot of times, if we get out the way and let nature do what it does, it will take care of itself. And so an example of that would just be like how I just mentioned, sometimes my mustards just go to seed. I'm okay with that. It's not the prettiest, like it starts growing these shoots and it dries out, but that's the beauty of it because it's still giving even in that state, because now it's producing seeds for you to use for next season. So it's always producing. And so I'm now putting less emphasis on how my garden looks and just more embracing what nature brings and how it takes care of itself, if that makes sense.
It does, because the less I try, the better my plants do.
There you go.
When I go on vacation and come back in 2 weeks, everything's growing. They're like, Dalia, we're doing just fine without you.
Exactly. If we just get out the way sometimes, I know we put a lot of emphasis on the fertilizing and the watering, but at the end of the day, nature knows best and it knows how to take care of itself. I think it's our job to help nurture. It's okay to help the process along, but I think when we start wanting to control it to the point where, we want to control how it looks, we want to control how it produces, we want to control what they look like coming out of the ground, that's not what we're here to do. So just taking care of the garden, but just taking care of our environment, of the earth, I think that's what we can do to help us along the process, and just getting out the way, just get out the way and let it do. Yeah, it's simple.
Good advice. I do want to ask you about cooking the garden and what to do with food scraps. You had an episode on your podcast about this, and I'm so curious. What are your suggestions?
Oh, yes. So we have a kitchen scrap series going on right now where I kind of share ways that you can repurpose your kitchen scraps. And there's so many different things that you can do to just become more sustainable, but just to also make the best out of our kitchen scraps. And so a few things you can do. I just recently had an episode about kitchen composting. So instead of just tossing banana peels or, any scraps from cooking, start creating a compost. Even if you're not a gardener, there are some community composting programs you can sign up for. You can gift your friends who are gardeners. You can gift them with compost, because compost is really, really great for soil. And so if you're a gardener and you're putting that compost back into your soil, it's feeding it nutrients. So your soil will love you, your plants will love you. It's fantastic. But then if you don't do the composting, you can repurpose a lot of your scraps in the food that you're making. So I love putting scraps into my soups and my stews. And so I found myself during Thanksgiving holiday, all of the leftover onion and carrots and tomatoes, I just made a big stew out of it. I saved my turkey carcasses and my turkey bones, and I made turkey soup. So there's so many creative ways that you can repurpose. And why do you want to repurpose? It's really simple for me. Sustainability for me is a key factor, it's something that's very important to me. But it also helps save money. My family knows, don't throw anything out. You better not throw anything out. Seeing food go to waste for me, it just does something to my soul. I hate to see food going to waste. So I'm always trying to find ways to maximize, and even if it's just, you've got this pile of food scraps, but you don't really compost, but you don't know what to do with it right away, stick it in the freezer. And that's typically what I do a lot, and it works. It works.
And then what happens? Because the freezer can just be like purgatory for a lot of foods. So what happens after you stick it in the freezer? Die, right?
No. So, I love that you asked this, because this is a part of the intentionality behind it and being mindful of, okay, this is what I'm doing with these scraps, and it's here and I need to use it up. So a lot of times if I can't get to it right away, I do pack it up, and I have what do you call those things? Those
I know what you mean, like a food sealer.
Saber sealer, yeah. So I do try, because that does prolong the freshness. And really what you're doing, you're flash freezing ingredients, and that's fine, because the nutrients still stay intact. So if you've got leftover, I keep using onion because I use a lot of onion in this house. So I will put that in the freezer and say, okay, this is going to go in a soup, or this is going to go in a stew. A lot of times I may prep it ahead of time so that if I'm in a pinch, I just take it out the freezer. There's no need to thaw it out. I just dump it in my soup, or I dump it in my stew. A lot of times I will use those for sauteing. The way I cook, I do a lot of sauteing. So that's another way that I will reuse it. But just making sure and just having that going into it, being intentional about reusing your scraps really, really helps. So sometimes it's a matter of training yourself, right? And getting into that habit. But once you develop that habit, it will just come naturally. Like I just look in the freezer now, like every day I cook, I'm like, okay, what's in here that I need to use up?
Yes. It's like a game. It's like a chopped every day at home. I love that.
Yeah.
Can we see what you have growing in the garden?
Sure, it's kind of a mess. And so I just have to preface by saying that this was a year for me that's been really, really hectic, but all good stuff. But I did a podcast episode about dealing with setbacks in the garden because I had all of these plans going into the new year, like, oh, I'm expanding my garden space and I'm going to be growing this and I'm going to be growing that. And guess what? A lot of that didn't happen. And so just giving yourself grace. But I'm happy to show you my lovely mess that I have back here.
Okay, so we're out here on your beautiful pool deck with a waterfall. You might come home one day and I'm just sitting in your pool.
Oh, you are more than welcome. I've tried to make this a refuge and a peaceful place for me.
So nice because you've got the pool, you've got the plants, and then
Yes.
it overlooks your backyard.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
on the pool deck, in these pots, what do we have?
So we've got some parsley going on, some curly parsley, some flat parsley. And you know, the thing I love about having my herbs back here is that it's easily accessible. I can come back here while I'm cooking. And as you can see, they're kind of small because I harvested them. So the thing with herbs, you need to harvest them constantly for them to continue to grow. So I just did a big harvesting of my parsley. So they're a little bit smaller and puny, but they're doing their thing. And parsley is very, very medicinal. I think it's probably one of the most underrated herbs out there.
Okay. And I take your point about having it where you can access it while you're cooking.
Yes.
Because my herbs are in raised beds on the side of the house.
Okay.
And I have to walk around the house almost to my neighbor's house. And when I'm cooking, it's usually dark at that point.
There, exactly.
So I gotta bring a lantern just to go
Yes.
grab some herbs.
Yeah, so it's, again, and this is just like one of those barrel thingies. I've got plenty of space. I can actually grow more herbs in there as well. So I'll probably add. I continue to add, when things kind of had their time here, I'll just add more and more. And then I've got some random stuff. I've got some soursop plants that I haven't planted yet. They're just baby seedlings. And I actually picked these up. So I typically go to local nurseries because they normally kind of set you up a little bit more for success rather than the big box stores. But I did see these at a big box store and I grabbed them immediately because it's soursop and why not? So they'll stay in pots for a while before I put them in the ground, if I decide to put them in the ground.
What can you do with soursop?
So soursop, have you ever had soursop?
Maybe in a drink?
So it's an exotic fruit. It's absolutely delicious. This is one of the fruits that do remind me of home because it does grow in warmer climates. You see them a lot in the Caribbean, in Central America, South America. They're a delicious fruit. They're sweet. And again, very, very healthy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then some random stuff. Like I've got these seedlings here that I'm like, okay, what am I going to do with these? I may give them to some neighbors, but these are just some collards. These are dying a little bit, but it's just random, the seedlings. Sometimes I can't help myself and I'm like, okay, let's see what sprouts up.
Ginain Grays writes about food on her website, CookPraySlay, and she hosts the podcast, Cook the Garden. Thanks to our mutual friend Ernest Hooper for suggesting this conversation. Ginain shared a few recipes from her garden, including poblano chicken squash chili, grilled plant-based skewers with seasonal veggies, and a few salad dressing recipes. Find them all on our website, thezestpodcast.com. I'm Dalia Colon. I produce The Zest with Andrew Lucas and Alexandria Ebron. The Zest is a production of WUSF, copyright 2024, part of the NPR network.